Newport mansions. And it is really great for us Newporters to have a chance to be here in New York, surrounded by people who love and are champions of art, history, and design, because that's what we do back in Newport. I want to thank Peter Leiden, Caroline Slayton, Julia Sucher, I should have you all raise your hands, Julia Sucher, and Riley O'Rourke, and also everybody from the Institute for inviting us here tonight. It's really a privilege to stand with you, and we are very much honored to be with you. For those of you who know Newport, it is a place like no other. Julian Fellows, who is the mastermind behind the TV series Downton Abbey, also the writer of the very famous show The Gilded Age, once called Newport a village of palaces. And I happen to think that he is right, because there is no other city in America quite like Newport, with its architectural masterpieces and its seaside charm. At the Preservation Society, we are not just preserving 11 historic sites, including the elms and the breakers, which you're going to hear a lot about. Today, we share stories. Stories of ambition, artistry, and vision that shaped America back in the 1880s and continues to shape America today. And each year we tell these stories to about 900,000 people through the tours that we give to visitors from around the world. Now that's not just a number, it's 900,000 journeys, 900,000 moments of inspiration, 900,000 opportunities to connect with the past, we think, in a deeply meaningful way. Our job at the Preservation Society is to take care of those 11 historic houses, some of which are National Historic Landmarks, and we do it with great pride and with great enthusiasm. Tonight, we have the chance to bring a touch of Newport to New York. Our program will focus on the culture of collecting during the Gilded Age, a time when the art and objects were not just possessions, but profound statements of identity and legacy and ambition. As one Gilded Age collector once said, a great collection is not just about what you own, it's about the story you leave behind. So we are very grateful to be here. I want to turn it over to Tony. Tony has a son at Brown University, so we are expecting him to bring his son to Newport and spend 2 or 3 days with us. We can't wait. And wish Tony and Leslie and Ulysses great luck tonight with your discussion. All great speakers. Thank you.
To start, I just wanted to say thank you. I'm thrilled to be here with these two formidable scholars. And at the invitation of the ICAA, whom I've long admired for their work promoting architecture and design that's rooted in historical precedents. I'm also a longtime fan of Peter Leiden, so it's doubly pleasurable to be here for that. The ICAA is one of the rare New York City organizations at whose events a journalist once wrote in a story I worked on that never, alas, saw the light of day, where you will, quote, find more bow ties than Botox. So that's, obviously I've been singing that line for 20 years. I was thinking, can I present it here tonight? I hope I haven't offended anyone. It's sort of a lifelong ambition. So I'm going to start to do a little bit of a formal introduction of these two. Bear with me, but I think their resumes deserve a public hearing. So Leslie B. Jones serves as the Director of Museum Affairs and Chief Curator for the Preservation Society of Newport County. She joined the Society in 2019 to oversee curatorial, conservation, collections management, site stewardship, exhibitions, interpretation, and programmatic initiatives such as family programs and lectures. Leslie directs the Fellows Program, which annually hosts 4 emerging scholars who focus a year of work on dedicated research opportunities, and I'm thinking her to apply. Before her move to Newport, Leslie was the Vice President of Museum Affairs and Curator of Decorative Arts at Cheekwood Estate and Gardens in Nashville, and prior to that, Curator and Director of Historical Resources and Programming for for the White House Historical Association. And then Ulysses Grant Dietz was the curator of decorative arts at the Newark Museum from 1980 until 2017, serving as chief curator for the last 5 years of his tenure. Overseeing 114 exhibitions covering all aspects of the decorative arts from colonial to contemporary, he studied and collected furniture, silver, base metals, glass, ceramics, textiles, and jewelry. And we're going to ask you about all of that tonight. His work on the reinterpretation of the Newark Museum's Valentine House, a National Historic Landmark built in 1885, was marked by a groundbreaking installation called House and Home. The author of numerous books and articles, and I hope I'm embarrassing you, but this is worth sharing. You've done some stuff. The author of numerous books and articles on decorative arts, Ulysses is a great-great-grandson of Ulysses and Julia Grant, and is a trustee of the Ulysses S. Grant Presidential Library at Mississippi State University and of the Society of Presidential Recipients. Okay, so again, 4 people do over here. Let's set the stage. The Preservation Society owns 11 properties, all of them remarkable in their own way, but 2 of the most notable are Cornelius Vanderbilt's Breakers, the exuberant Italian Renaissance palazzo completed in 1895 and designed by New York's Richard Morris Hunt. And then there is Edward Berwin's The Elms, a more restrained French neoclassical pile from 1901, so 6 years later, designed by Philadelphia's Horace Trumbauer. So Leslie, can you just sort of tell us a bit about the 2 buildings and sort of set the scene, the buildings, the owners, and their architects?
Sure, thank you. And I'll let Ulysses jump in here whenever he'd like to as well, but Vanderbilt and Berwin are certainly peers, as you can see here on the screen, but they come from remarkably different backgrounds, even though they exist in this sort of same societal and business environment during the Gilded Age. Cornelius Vanderbilt, of course, comes from multiple generations of wealth and experience in working with art dealers and understanding what art and collections mean to him in his various houses, including here in New York and in Newport. And Edward Berwin is sort of new to the scene. He's the first generation American born of his family. His parents are immigrants from Germany. His father, I believe, well, I know, actually I don't believe, he was a musical instrument maker and repairman in Philadelphia. And Berwin and his brother, following his tenure in the Navy, created the Berwin White Coal Mining Company. And their wealth just boomed within a matter of years. But they're both collecting. They're both collecting from the same dealers. They're both building houses in the same cities. They're both choosing prominent architects, but their philosophy about what they put in those houses seems to have very distinct differences. And so Ulysses and I were talking about giving this talk. We wanted to make sure that because there are 11 historic houses in our collection, there are so many stories we can tell, but these 2 seem to have such an interesting differentiation, even though they are these great peers. So I don't know if Ulysses, you want to add anything to that?
Well, I love these images of them because you're the first one who ever, if you've seen the TV show The Gilded Age, or read stories about the Vanderbilts, that the tagline that always floats over their heads is new money. But Cornelius Vanderbilt, when he builds the Breakers, is old money. He's 3rd generation, which in America is old money. And it's really big money. They are the richest family in America. That doesn't last forever, but that's true. So the Breakers, for Cornelius and his wife Alice, has to live up to that reputation. And it's also in Newport, which is a huge transformation for them, because the first heir of the Commodore's wealth, William Henry Vanderbilt, doesn't even think about Newport, doesn't try to go to Newport, and so there's a social and psychological and historical leap that they're making. And I'd never thought about that, as opposed to Berwin, who jumps right into Newport. He has a great house in New York City, but he jumps right into Newport. And to me, I'm looking at the pictures of the men, so I'm pointing at the screen that you can't see, but you can see them over my head. So I'm wearing a necktie that Kip Forbes gave me when I was a 25-year-old curator, and he was a trustee at the Newark Museum, and it says "Capitalist Tool" on it. And Leslie didn't even know what that meant because she's that young. But I used to see the Ford's airplane that was called the capitalist tool at Newark Airport, dark green with a gold logo. And so that's why I thought I'd wear that, because these guys would have worn that title with pride because capitalism was their purpose. And at the Newark Museum we had a beer baron's house, the Ballantyne family's house, and Mrs. Ballantyne in the 1890 census was listed as a capitalist. And she was a widow, but she was a capitalist. And so I think that, so I've been pondering that because all of this comes out of this great explosion of capitalism in America after the Civil War. And needless to say, my ancestor, and for whom I'm named, is a capitalist in New York. He thinks he is. He's about to lose it all. But in the 1880s, when all this is happening with the Vanderbilts, he's right there in New York playing this game. And he's a friend of William Henry Vanderbilt's. And he goes to these parties, even though he's never really in it. So all of this is very resonant with what's going on broadly in America. And the thing is, it's happening in New York City, but it's happening in every city in the country. And a lot of what happened in New York is gone, but it survives in Newport. And I just wanted to bring this in. This is a total non sequitur, but that my love for Newport is professional, but it started out as a student taking architectural history courses at Yale in 1973 with Vincent Scully. And I had a book on Newport architecture, and I drove up with friends to Newport on the weekend, and that was the first time I'd seen it. And it was Newport Preservation Society as it had just come into its fullness. And it blew my mind, and that's 50 years ago when I fell in love with Newport, and my passion for that town and everything it represents has just gotten deeper and deeper with time. And that includes the interest in all of these people. It's not just about the houses, it's about why they exist.
Well, on the Vincent Scully question, you also mentioned that Vincent Scully, he found Newport's significance in its colonial history, which was also how the Preservation Society began, saving colonial architectural heritage. And then we pivoted and turned our sights on Bellevue Avenue to save houses like the Breakers, which is here. But it's, sorry?
It's a great view of it. No one ever thinks of that facade. That's the side.
Yes, this is the south side of the Breakers in 1895. That was just completed. A record in completion, by the way. This house was built in 2 years. If you think about people getting their kitchens redone, kudos to Richard Morris Hunt for driving this effort. Sorry, go ahead, John.
Can you talk about the transformation a little bit before we jump into it?
Sure.
So you have this colonial town. I mean, I think about some of these incredible 1920s, 30s houses that have been deemed obsolete now by people who, sort of the current capitalist tools who need, 10,000 square foot, dressing rooms. And what must release the conventions of their time? Are people pulling out their hair, the ones who loved old Newport?
It's a good question. I think it's not so black and white in that sense. I mean, Newport's having this slow revival following the Civil War. It actually becomes sort of a summer retreat for the intelligentsia of Boston and New York, with poets, artists, writers coming. The Cape Catherine Historic Hill neighborhood is being developed at the time with Richard Morris Hunt as architect. Bellevue Avenue and places like Over Point, where the Breakers is located, hasn't yet emerged. It's still pastoral farmland. So there's a romanticism about Newport that's starting to draw people. Well, capitalism, very quickly in terms of the development and the desire for Newport takes hold, and Bellevue Avenue gets parceled out, and lots become, it's essentially the Gilded Age cul-de-sac. I mean, this space is being parceled out very quickly by Smith and Bailey, who were two land prospectors. And they're buying up pieces of property from the Wetmores and Chateau-sur-Mer and cutting down their Wetmores are happily selling it because they're making great money. But it's a slow progress into the 1890s when it really reaches its height. In terms of people looking back now in the 1920s and 30s, I think that will have its renaissance too, because that's really the American country place era. And a lot of those houses are, they were reaching out of the urban areas. I think we actually also, maybe we already saw the renaissance of that with COVID. People reaching out of the city for just a little bit more square footage, just for the essence of nature around you, not even just the size of the house. And
I'm looking at this great view of the Breakers, and I think having read Michael Catherine's book on the pre-Vanderbilt country houses in Newport, that Newport was a boom town for country houses and for summer living from the 18th century on. First it was Southern planters, which is Newport was the center of the slave trade, and so Southerners felt comfortable coming there, and they started staying there in the summers. And there was this huge boom, and I can't remember the local architect. There was Seth Bradford and somebody else. This is from being old as the pain in the neck. But so there were hundreds of summer houses in Newport before this happened. And when you're looking at the breakers, you're looking at the first house of its kind in the New World. Certainly in America, but in the world. There is nothing like it. And we're not talking about Alva down the road and Marble House, but that's the first house of its kind at all in this country. So these were intended to make a statement, their existence. I mean, really, it's built on the site of a huge house. I mean, the old breakers that was the tobacco, the Lorillard family, was actually, the footprint was just as big as this. It's almost the same footprint. But the volume just explodes. So this is not just saying, oh, I'm going to build another summer house, just like everybody else. This is Cornelius and Alice saying, okay, we got a one-up Alva, who beat us by a couple of years, but we've got to do something that really makes it clear who we are. And so this clearly was built to rattle cages. There was no question about it. They weren't saying, oh, we want to fit in, we don't want to offend anybody. There is no going to say, this is the biggest house on the street. And I also happen to think it's the greatest building Richard Morris Hunt ever built. And I've studied the breakers a lot, and I know his work, and he did a lot of incredible stuff in Newport. So it's also like the culmination of his career, because they were the perfect clients. They had all the money in the world, and they didn't interfere, and it was a vast job. So he got to do what he wanted.
And then he died the same year it was finished. So we sort of understand how that process worked. But also the elms, just as a comparison from a facade perspective, Horace Trumbauer, unlike Richard Morris Hunt, is not classically trained. He goes through more apprenticeship programs. He's not being sent off to formal architectural school. Richard Morris Hunt is the first American accepted to l'École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. So he is getting this rich influence not only of architectural study and training, but also this merging of artistry, the collaboration between designers, craftspeople, architects, and really brings it to American professionalized practice. Trumbauer reaps the benefits of that. And his specialty is copying. And that somehow foreshadows Berwin's collecting opportunities. And one of the things Ulysses and I were talking about in preparation for this is this very big distinction between the Vanderbilts and the Berwins in this same era. And that is, the Vanderbilts are really collecting things for provenance. And this really becomes sort of the forefront of modern collecting now. They're looking specifically at objects that are incredibly beautiful and beautifully made, but they have a story to tell, a history to say. That's incredibly important. Whereas the Berwins, it's more about who owned it versus who made it. And Edward Berwin is really collecting to work in the same circles as his peers, like Henry Clay Frick and Henry Walters. He's going to Europe and he's sourcing things because they're in vogue. I think René Gimpel in his of Gimpel and Wildenstein, which was a really important firm, art advisory and art dealer firm in Paris, wrote in his diaries, which are at the Smithsonian, that Berwin had great reverence for his German ancestry. It's something he held dear and talked about a lot, but the only thing he loved more than that was French paintings. And that's not because I think he had this natural draw to it, it's because he thought he needed to have them. And so, being the coal king of the 19th and 20th century, he got them.
So could you go back to the breakers for a minute, because one of the things that I spent all of my career obsessing about the Gilded Age in one way or another, and it's hard to see it, but you compare the breakers with the elms, and the general public, the 900,000 people who go through these houses, because they're two of the most popular houses, it is almost impossible to explain to them how they're different, but they are different. The breakers is sort of the culmination, the last explosive gesture of the modern Gilded Age. that, believe it or not, this is a modern house technologically, and even though it's evoking a Renaissance, a Florentine palace, because they love the Medicis. Rich Americans love the Medicis because they started out not noble. They were pharmacists. That's what the coat of arms of the Medicis is. And so you see this as a modern house in conception and in the way it's lived in. And then if you switch to the elms, this is an anti-modern house. This is embracing, saying, rejecting the modern world, rejecting what they think already by 1900 is the ugly Victorian, and embracing the 18th century, a conscious mimicking of 18th century in order to tap into that aristocratic connection. Because that is, if you think about it, Frank Lloyd Wright is working, he's doing great stuff by this time, but people like the Vanderbilts don't want to touch Frank Lloyd Wright. Museums love Frank Lloyd Wright, they love the arts and crafts movement, they love the Art Nouveau, but rich Americans didn't like any of those things, mostly. This is what they want, and that's why Trumbauer, this is one of the greatest surviving Trumbauer buildings in the country. And it's that sort of pure French, with one exception, which is the dining room, this sort of pure French vision. And it's like, okay, no, I'm never gonna remember it, the Museum de Commando in Paris, which is somewhat later, but it's the same impetus. So anyway, let's go on.
The Vanderbilts are collecting things because of provenance. From the Palazzo Borghese in Rome, they acquired two particular pieces, and these are both in our permanent collection. One being the poltrone on the left, the throne chair from the Borghese family, and the other being this winter console table. It's one of four of the Four Seasons that was from the Borghese family. And in the early 1890s, 1891, that palazzo is starting to be dismantled and it's being parceled out and sold the interior furnishings. There's an 1892 and 1893 sale in New York at Chez Moore of these materials, or that we thought were of these materials. But actually, recently, a scholar out of Rome who's working on these exact pieces as part of the Borghese historiography of the collection believes that these pieces actually went to London in 1891 before that sale. So, in essence, what we're seeing, the Vanderbilts they have agents all over already. They're buying tapestries from Florence in the 1880s. They're going on trips to meet with their architects in Europe. They're familiarizing themselves with these materials.
Do they have an agent? Do they have one curator or like a Duveen?
No, multiple. And this is basically what paves the way for Duveen. And by the way, Renee Campbell is Duveen's brother-in-law. So they're all in cahoots together. But these pieces are collected because they have the provenance of the Borghese family. And when we see this table, the console table here, that was destined for the music room at the Breakers, the morning room at the Breakers, the proportion of this and the colorations in it is exactly echoed in that room designed by Jules. So the probability is that too, these pieces were inspiration for the interiors as well, which is quite remarkable if you consider that.
And so, now, is Hunt advising them, or did they buy these before the Breakers was built?
Well, they had to have been purchased around 1891 because that's when their time in London ends. So the going thought is that one of two things could have happened. And this is why I still have a job, because we don't know all the answers. In 1891, it could be, we just recently came across information through an intern in Paris that Jules created. He's the interior designer of both the Elms and the Breakers. But he opens an office in London. And so he's already sourcing French material for his clients in Paris. But now there's the opportunity opened up that perhaps he's also sourcing things in London. So to be determined, but thankfully there's a brilliant young woman named Francesca Baldini who is researching these right now, so I'm hoping that her paper gives us a definitive answer.
And what I love about this parallel is that, the big red Baroque throne chair, which I did not know was from the Borgheses. But you see, the Vanderbilts, and when I say the Vanderbilts, I mean them and everybody like them. They're just there first. In all my research on the Gilded Age, I kept trying to avoid the Vanderbilts and realize that they're really the ones who start this. This whole trend, which continues to sweep through, although it shifts. And that's why I wanted to talk about these. These two pieces, one of them is Baroque and one of them is neoclassical. And they're both Italian, and they're both, the important thing is they were associated with a name that everybody in America knew. Now, nobody in America knew who the Doria Pamphili's were, and that's a great palace in Rome too. But this is about a name that everybody recognized. But it's also, look at these things. The whole issue that I've thought about my whole career is, what is good taste? And you all think you know what it is, but none of you know what it is. You know what your parents thought it was, and your grandparents, and you've either accepted it or rejected it. I plunged into the 19th century, which my family thought was repulsive. But these are both huge, they're early objects that are hugely Victorian in their aesthetic. They're elaborate, they're gilded, they're fancy, they're obvious, tons of expensive hand labor because that was important. And so these are anti-modern objects because they're antique. So they're better than anything anybody could make in the day because they're old and they're unique, and therefore I have the only one, although there were four. I hadn't heard that before. So you've got to understand, from a Victorian point of view, this is not about good taste. This is about power, the power of name, the power of aristocratic connection, and beauty. Because did Alice think these were beautiful? Did Cornelius think they were beautiful? We don't know because they don't write about it. And maybe they didn't care, but maybe they did. It's so frustrating that we don't know. We know Hunt loved the Breakers, and then we know that Trumbauer, that's a different artist. Trumbauer was proud of the elms, but we don't really know how the Vanderbilts felt about the Breakers, but we know they must have been proud of it because it had all of these associations. And I think there's a next slide. You want to say anything about that?
No.
I'm just nattering on, so okay.
There we go.
And
High
this,
contrast.
and this is, but I wanted to point out that what's going on in the Breakers is Allard, working with Hunt, is making all of this incredible furniture brand new, custom. And brand new, custom-made furniture is as much of a status symbol to most rich people as antiques are at this point. The glamour of the antique has not really caught on. In the aesthetic movement, the great Hopkins House in San Francisco, it's all brand new, it's all modern. It's Anglo-Japanese modern. That's the status symbol. This is the old taking on that glamour, but this is American. This is designed by Ogden Codman, made in Boston probably out of expedience, although you don't really know the history. Machine made, but handmade, custom made for Alice's bedroom at the Breakers. And this is something that you've got to be a Vanderbilt to do this. And some people walk into, I don't know who walked into Alice's bedroom. Now that I think of that, Cornelius, the children, but maybe her friends. It's a huge room. Maybe she had friends in there. But people saw that room and they said, ooh, this is all made custom for her. And it's that nice young designer, Ogden Codman, who's so well connected in Boston, who designed it. And if they are New Englanders, as a lot of people in Newport were, ooh, it was made by Davenport. She's using local makers. That's a good thing too. So there's a lot of, it's a beautiful chair, but this is the kind of thing most museums in the United States would not be caught dead owning. And I think this is a treasure, and this is what Newport has that no other museum in the country has, is this incredible collection of both Allard and Davenport by Ogden Codman. Because the Breakers, this idea of the white painted French furniture, it is introduced to the United States in this house by that architect in those bedrooms. It's the first time that appears in America. It's already in France, but Codman brings that and the Vanderbilts spearhead.
So Codman did the private quarters upstairs? Did
The upstairs rooms. Allard did downstairs.
So what was...
And Vanderboyen.
Yeah.
We assume it was a compilation of architects and designers for expediency, but also Codman did possess several qualities that were desirable for the Vanderbilts. He was young, he was well known, he was well liked, he had great connections. He was introduced to Cornelius Vanderbilt by Teddy Wharton, Edith Wharton's husband. So he offered them also a vehicle to enter old New England, whereas they were New Yorkers, but Codman was old New England. So I think that there's a whole host of different objectives here, but expediency is probably the main one. And that's, I think, to Ulysses' point, with having new furniture created by Arau, you have the Borghese tables and chairs and other small decorative pieces that are, and fine art that are created. They're collected to populate these interiors, but you've got to have it all furnished in 2 years. So Arau is in his workshop in France, making the 18th century in the 19th century, so that if you're opening the doors to the breakers for your welcoming party, no one knows the difference.
But they were turning to the French maker for the public presentation, but would they have given that commission to a young American? Or?
It's a good question, because it's also sort of the distinction between generations. You have William H., who's before, who's Cornelius' father, and he's employing the Herder brothers. He is all American in New York. And they're also collecting contemporary art. He's a major patron of the Barbizon School. And his son is going in the opposite direction. He is collecting works of history, of past, of what he considers substance. So it's a good question. I wish that Cornelius Vanderbilt had written a memoir because it would solve so many of our issues. But we can assume through what's in Newport, as well as at 1 West 57th Street, which was their home in New York, that in which they traded objects back and forth. A lot of what we'll see tonight actually originated in New York and then went to Newport. So I wish I had a definitive answer, but I don't. We're gonna keep rolling through provenance. And
this is not the Vanderbilt.
No, but it's Houghton Hall, home to Lord and Lady Cholmondeley right now, but it was also home to Horace Walpole. And the Walpole family collection that came up for sale, there was a huge sale in the 18th century that everybody knows went to Catherine the Great, but parts of the collection were also sold in 1886 at Christie's in London. And these two paintings were purchased and then distributed to Cornelius Vanderbilt through Asher, I forget Asher's last name,
Asher Wertheimer.
Wertheimer, yes. A very, very famous London antique dealer. And so these are very two interesting portraits. Both were at the Breakers. The portrait on the left, Anna Ditchley, is still there. She hangs above the morning room fireplace. Lucy Loftus was above the music room fireplace. She is a very interesting portrait as well, because it's the only known work of art that we can tell from architectural records that an architect working on the Breakers thought about when designing a space. It's actually documented in his sketches. And it's from memory, because it's not the exact portrait, but it's the same position. So Van der Boyen is a young architect from Paris. His father went to school with Richard Morris Hunt at École des Beaux-Arts. So he's brought in to do just the music room. And somehow this, obviously having been purchased around 1886 by the Vanderbilts, was already in their collection. And so they decided to sort of build the room around it. It was, until recently, still owned by the family. And Sir Peter Lilly, the artist of both of these portraits, but particularly for Lucy Loftus, it was just sold at Christie's a few years ago, and it was Lilly's best day. Far exceeded its auction estimate, but it's gone to a private collection. But we do fortunately have the Anna Ditchley still in its place above the fireplace in the morning room. And I have Houghton Hall's Commons Parlor on the right here, because if you'll notice above, in the center of the image above the door, you'll see Lucy Loftus there. In 2013, we were fortunate to partner with Houghton Hall, where Cholmondeley brought together the Walpole collection once more, including works from Russia, which would never happen now. But the Hermitage Museum, the Preservation Society, and other private collectors lent to repopulate the walls of the interiors. It was, I wasn't here for that, but it must have been really something.
And just a comment here is that this idea of collecting English portraits is an invention of the Gilded Age, because nobody cares about them until then. And then it becomes something that they're all English, that's the Rothschilds and the Huntingtons and the Vanderbilts are all fighting for the same stock. These are the first people to collect this material in this country, and they're doing it. It's that old joke about buying ancestral portraits, except that's not the way they're thinking about it. But they're buying portraits of fancy old people that they can put in their house. I mean, and I don't know what you feel about Lely, but he's a pretty great Baroque painter, late Baroque painter, and suddenly, and I don't know who started that. But you said Asher Wertheimer, which is really interesting. So he's one of the great art and antique dealers in London. Sargent painted portraits of all of his family, so they're all still out there. There's a whole dozen of them, and so it's through people who know stuff and know people and know collections that these collections are accessible to people like the Vanderbilts, because they're not hunting through antique shops. They're going to experts and saying, "Find me things." And they may pick them out. They may say, "Oh no, I like the color of her dress. It would look good in the music room." You know, what you said about that is really fascinating to me. That they really sort of, the paintings go with the room. They're not buying them purely because they're beautiful, and I'm sure they do like them because they're romantic and they evoke like the good old days. Nobody knew how horrible it really was in the 17th century in the Gilded Age. So.
There's something else I was going to say, but now I forgot. But this goes to reaffirming again from the Vanderbilt perspective. They are acquiring because of provenance. It's who has owned it. Lely, again, not the most fantastic nor most desirable artist of the period, but they are acquiring things because they have fancy histories, at least according to their standards.
They're third generation wealth, but that still feels like they're part of it a little bit. They need to acquire these artifacts or marry off their daughters to the British nobility to really get whatever the social acceptance they're striving. They want wealth in the world. They want something.
I have a theory about that. And this is the most notorious one, being Alva, the sister-in-law who marries off her daughter to the Duke of Marlborough. But I remember talking about this with a friend and saying, we were not doing this because we felt inferior to the British. We were doing this because we felt superior to the European aristocracy, because we ruled the world and we were buying their stuff. And that shows up a little bit in Edith Wharton in Custom of the Country, that it's acquiring these tapestries from the French noblemen is a victory, because you've taken their stuff away and put it in your house. And so I don't think this is about, I mean, we were trying to be like them, but we were not feeling subservient to them. And we didn't have all the stuff in this country to collect, so we were going there. I do think there's this sort of fascination with aristocracy, because we don't have one, and we're trying to create one, and people like the Vanderbilts are trying to set themselves. And how do you do that without a title? You do it with the things and with the houses.
So we mentioned 1 West 57th Street, which was the Vanderbilt family home in New York. And
So Richard Morrison? Or not?
no, Post.
George Post.
George Post, yes. And so this is the ballroom on 57th. And if you look closely, on the right-hand side in one of the paneling, you'll see a tall clock. And that clock is the clock on the left. So this clock was destined, if you go back for a minute, if you can sort of see the proportion, how it exists in this room. The room is on a grand scale, but if you see the way that the paneling is designed, it fits perfectly, it's framed perfectly in this paneling. And it was sold to the Vanderbilts as André Charles Boulle. It's definitely not Boulle, but that didn't matter.
It was Boulle-like.
Boulle-like, yes. And then Juilliard also adds a child on top strangling a rooster.
He's hugging a chicken.
Well, it's
Strangling a rooster.
There's just a comparison here. Another Boulle clock that's in the Metropolitan Museum of Art's collection, just to sort of show proportion and elegance and how it's probably not the same. But Ulysses, you have a great point about it didn't matter if it wasn't actually
Boulle was one of, again, in this Gilded Age thing moment when rich Americans are beginning to buy FFF, fine French furniture. They're not going for the delicate little painted things. They're going for this big, bold 17th, early 18th century French stuff, because it suits this Victorian taste for mass and elaboration. And the fact that whether the Vanderbilts knew that Allard had added the baby and the chicken to improve it, or to replace something that was missing. It doesn't actually make any sense because it's all asymmetrical on a very Baroque clock. But they may have known that and they wouldn't have cared because the pristine original condition of antiques was not important. Finish didn't matter. It had to be shiny and bright. So all that gilding was redone for the Vanderbilts. Probably all the gilding on all the Boule in the world has been redone because somebody in the 19th century wanted it to look new. So I just remember it's the sense of connoisseurship. This is not about an aristocratic owner, but it's about an aristocratic maker who made stuff. The royal family in England had Boule furniture, and Alva actually went and had her stuff copied from theirs, the stuff at Windsor Castle. So this is very conscious, and it's awareness of quality, but it's not connoisseurship in the sort of romantic intellectual sense that we consider it, because that only exists in a couple of places this early in the US.
I will pivot to the Elms. So this is Edward Berwin's library at the Elms. So just down the street on Bellevue Avenue. This house is begun in 1899 and finished in 1901. Again, record time. What I love about this room the most, it doesn't show on the image, but I think they were so confident that they could get it done much quicker that on the mantle, it's actually engraved 1900, but doesn't actually open until a year later. Jules Lau is also the interior designer for this house. He is working with Horace Trumbauer as the architect. And there's also a very distinct difference between the relationships of the two architects and Allard and his treatment project. So Richard Morris Hunt is also a collector and a purveyor of material objects to his clients. Trumbauer, not so much. He's pretty well focused in on the building itself, and he's working very directly with the Allard studio, which now has a New York office by the time this house is built, to help sort of bring things together. And I chose this image in particular to talk a little bit about Berwin and what he also used his art collection for. And that echoes his building of empire. He's not just showing off because he's fancy, he's actually trying to break into the social set at the time. He's pretty well established, but he's not accepted by the top of the top. So having a house on, first of all, he owned another house on Bellevue Avenue in the exact same place, also called the Elms, and then tears that down and has this incredibly beautiful estate built, totally different. What was an actual Newport cottage is now a Newport palace. And the interiors are incredibly telling, as well as the collection. He is trying to essentially copy people like his peers, as I mentioned before. Henry Walters is one. In historic images of this room, the table in the center is populated with small Italian bronze figures. Henry Walters has a massive collection of these as well. He's working with Henry Clay Frick. He's working with J.P. Morgan in a lot of these massive international coal deals that he's doing. So he's in connection with these individuals. He's also well known for beginning his collection. 1894 is the first documented experience where he's loaning his collection to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Cornelius Vanderbilt's already on board, and now he's loaning it, trying to get himself into. So he's using his collection as more of collateral in a way for his social ambitions. And he's pictured there in the center.
Yes, that's you.
Mm-hmm. So he's collecting from a wide variety of places, and I really wish that we could publish Rene Gimpel's diaries about his interactions with Berwin. They're really quite funny. But this particular piece here, the roundel, if you look at the top image, the black and white image, through the doorway, you'll see that same roundel in Émile Gavet's Paris apartment. Now, Émile Gavet is a trained architect in Paris. He's also become, by the late 1880s, a renowned collector of French material. He's collecting contemporary art like Jean-Francois Millet. He's also collecting historical art, Renaissance, and Gothic, as he calls it. He decides in 1889 to create a catalog of his artwork and starts selling it, actually. Well, he sold it once before, but he's selling it more and more to Americans. And Al Vanderbilt's the first one to come and pillage the Gimpel collection, or excuse me, the Gavay collection.
She buys 1,100 pieces.
Over 300. He has over 1,100 in his
Oh,
collection.
she buys 300.
And so Berwin's seeing that, and he is then also going to Paris in the mid-1890s and buying directly from Emile Gavay. And this is sort of the genesis of him looking not only of who the collector was, but specifically who the artist is. And this is after Della Robbia. And there's another image, also from the Gavay collection, this Della Robbia plaque, which is back at the Elms after having been sold as part of the house's 1961 auction. So Gavay is sort of becoming a source for a lot of these wealthy Americans to pick from in terms of what he's collecting. He's finding a great business model of it, actually. And Della Robbia is hot. If you actually look at the Nelson Atkins, if you look at the Met, if you look at the Isabella Stewart Gardner, all the Della Robbias are coming from the Gavay collection. So it's actually quite an interesting overlap. I'm not sure that all these collectors knew that they were all sourcing their Della Robbias from him. Whether they all are Della Robbia is also another question. But it becomes, the Italian Renaissance becomes a real fanatic collecting spree, as does, it sort of sets up Bernard Berenson for all of his exploits in selling Italian art, telling people what's best and what's not at the turn of the century. But Berwin is seeing this, he's seeing his friends purchase these, so then he is also going and giving himself an example of it too.
Can I ask a question? Is what's going on in Newport different from what's going on in New York in terms of the types of pieces or the types of art that they're installing in those houses? Or is it
It's a
really thinking location?
I think it's strategic. I have not been able to study Berwin's New York house as well as I would like to. And when he passed, his wife had passed before him, and when he passes, his entire estate, including his New York townhouse, the collections, we're almost running out of time, collections, and Newport go to his sister Julia. And all that gets sold when he dies are his books. So, and his jade collection. So we're not entirely sure, but I think that New York is used more for entertaining his business colleagues, especially for Berwin, and Newport's more for, his social catapult.
I sort of meant in general, just the sort of Gilded Age financiers, capitalists. Were they thinking about their homes, their summer homes, differently than their city homes? Were they accomplishing something different? Obviously, they were entertaining different people, same people that were just all decamped from one place to another, or
Definitely not the same people. Newport was a much more closed-off society. Fewer houses. It took longer. It was more difficult to get through. There were no bridges. You had to either take your private yacht, the Fall River Line, or your private railroad car to Wickford, Rhode Island, and take a ferry over. So it was not easy to get there. And most of these houses, too, as an aside, aren't designed with massive amounts of guest rooms. You're not entertaining people who are coming. You're entertaining the people that are already there. So it's an interesting sort of setup. You think all these big, massive houses must have incredible amounts of space to entertain people to stay over at. That's certainly not the case. So this is the Elms ballroom, and if we were standing in this space to the immediate right, we would have seen this image. And this is, on the left is the only documentation we have of the La Vigneria in situ. So this was an incredibly important 18th century French self-portrait that René Gimpel sold to Edward Berwin in 1908 for $18,000. He's also selling from Fragonard, Boucher, and a David, all of which are now in the Metropolitan Museum of Art's collection. But again, he's buying these because he sees the value in what they can provide for him socially. I mean, this is a coal baron's house, but he has these delicate, wonderful self-portraits of French women by incredibly important artists to showcase and to talk through with his guests. Do you want to comment on this? In the interest of time, you might want to get to the last slide.
Yeah, that has always been one of my favorite pictures of the Metropolitan Museum, and I always thought it was by somebody else.
this is sort of where we'll end off. We started with a beautiful image of the Elms dining room, and we'll end there too. But as a house that's French, being almost copied directly as a French document, there's one room that many rooms stand out, but this is a Venetian dining room. It's very Victorian, it's interior design, but it is an assembly of some of the most incredible Venetian, 17th and 18th century Venetian paintings outside of Venice. And it's a hallmark for Berwind, even though it gets lost in history. I'm not quite sure why, but his collections don't continue on as this remarkable assembly of artworks. But we have a Sebastiano Ricci. There are two Riccis that are in this collection, and they're all depicting every image here that's in this space and also in the front hall are all depicting the life of Scipio Africanus. And they've been brought out of several Venetian palazzo. So, palazzi, is that the palazzi name? So it's again very strategic. Ricci is having a moment in the Gilded Age. People are writing about his biography, how he's been accused of murder and has to flee Venice, and has this really interesting romantic intrigue in his biography. So again, Berwind is strategically acquiring pieces like this, and I think these were actually probably acquired by Allard, sourced by Allard, and put into this space because he designed the room around them.
And I love this room in the Elms, because to me it's the most vibrant room in the house, because it's a real throwback to Berwind's worldview of a dining room as a Renaissance style masculine room, which goes back to H.A. Downing in the 1850s, is that the idea that a dining room is a man's room and it should be in a sober man's style like the Renaissance. Alexander Roux was making Renaissance furniture for places like that. So it's an odd thing sitting in the middle of the Elms, because no logical 18th century French house would have had a room like this in it. So it's also the romantic attachment to Venice is just beginning in the American world, and there will be a whole huge colony of Americans in Venice. Maybe it's starting now, but so this really reflects that, and I think it makes the room feel very different. It's also a very modern room, especially in the placement of the light fixtures, which is very much a turn of the 20th century. You can see. So it's a wonderful hodgepodge that shows you that these people are doing stuff that resonates with them emotionally, and not just for the sort of social purposes of it. He clearly cared about this room a lot.
To pivot to the Breakers dining room, when I was doing a little research, I came across Robert A. Stern was writing about the inscription on the mantelpiece in the Breakers dining room, which Stern writes, "Lest anyone think the Vanderbilts were materialistic parvenus," and it's the inscription is, "Little do I care for riches, and do not miss them, for only cleverness prevails in the end." I think all the images we've seen prior to this,
That's great.
yeah. So
It's a great way to wrap up.